it has like this almost double side connotation to it. You know, the positive side that it's like I was saying, that reminds me a little bit even of my childhood, thinking of grains, of my quinoa, of the bread that we eat. But then later, understanding a little bit the history of some of the grains, especially like wheat and also corn and stuff in more recent times, it almost has a little bit of a negative side of things as well, you know, because it's been like this, the Green Revolution was pushed like through the production of these big grains, you know, and imposing in many cases. And through my life, I've been working with indigenous people in different countries, and I've seen how that affected directly to some of them in certain cases, their own cultural identity even, you know, so thinking about grains, that's what I mean, like it's a difficult one because it's like there's so many things in it. I am from Bolivia, as we call it, the heart of South America. And so growing up there, I was always exposed to a lot of different cultures because it's such a diverse place where I was. I lived in the city of La Paz, which is a big city, but it's a very, very beautiful and multicultural city. And so I was always exposed to many different indigenous groups. My family comes from 2 different indigenous groups as well. So I was always in connection with a lot of these things. And growing up, traveling with my father, because my father, as an agronomist, he used to travel a lot to rural areas. So I used to travel with him, and I always found myself playing and trying to learn things in all these villages and places where I was. And that's what I was feeling always very connected with, you know, learning from people, learning from these other cultures that weren't necessarily mine. Ethnobiology is basically this studying the interaction of people with their environment. So trying to understand that. And I realized that working with indigenous people, I was learning way more than what I was actually learning at the university. We talk about here in my current work, we talk a lot about the idea of decolonizing our kitchen, decolonizing our work. And I felt like I've been trying to do that for a long time, you know, because I also knew that when I was studying, when I was trying to become an ethnobiologist proper, there was like these professionals that come to my country to do research, and often from different countries, often from the US or from Europe, and they were the experts coming to do the work in our places. And that's the history of Latin America and Asia and Africa and places like that, you know, and I felt like I want to change that a little bit, you know, I want to try to do something different and in a sense, decolonize that idea. I want to prepare myself and I want to go work in those places, you know, and that's one of the things that led me here. And now I'm working in here, continuing this idea, continuing to work with the perspective of indigenous people and understanding how they see life, how they interact with their environment, their foods and their grains in particular, you know, because everywhere I go, they always are using grains that are, like I said, a very important staple, you know, in maybe different grains. In the high Andes, they were using a lot of quinoa, but in Amazonia, Mexico, Guatemala, they use so much corn, obviously. But then I come here and I realize that they're using a lot of wild rice, but also a lot of corn. But then also amaranth is another big part of it, that it's also delicious. And then by getting into that, I start learning about other types of grains as well, you know, so. Grains, they're always around, you know, they're a big part of people. And like I said, food in general also, it's something so important. It's such a big part of culture. So it is at the same time, because of it, I guess it's a big part of who you are. You know, your food represents who you are, represents part of your identity and stuff like that. So by that is something really interesting, to find that connection of what how people define themselves and how they use their foods to define themselves. You know, like in Bolivia, again, like in the high Andes, for instance, they're using a lot of quinoa, but quinoa is considered like the most important crop ever, you know, but historically, not only because it's a superfood, like it's categorized here, you know, because it's so nutritional, so beneficial to you, for you and all of that, but it's just historically, it's been the grain that can grow in these really, really harsh environments and does so well. And because of that, people really, really take care of it, you know, they really appreciate it. And also because they have these beautiful colors, that it could be yellow, could be red, could be whitish, that when they're growing, the landscape just becomes this kind of bland landscape, if you want, in the high Andes, because it's almost like a desert, like, you know, it's very, very bland. But then you have these patches of beautiful reds or beautiful golds and stuff. And those colors also have important meanings for the culture, you know, so you can see how the grain is not giving them food, but it's giving them a lot more than that. It's giving them part of the culture, it's giving them some other meaning for their environment, some other meaning for who they are, you know. So they will represent some of those colors in their clothing or stuff like that as well, you know, because it comes from the land, it comes from La Pachamama, you know, the Mother Earth, that it's offering this beautiful thing. And on top of that, it's super nutritional, it's super delicious and easy to care, it's easy to cook and all of that, you know. So it becomes like a really, really important thing. And then you go to other parts of, let's say within Bolivia, you go to the lowlands, you go to Amazonia, and then you realize that they're using a lot of corn, you know, another grain that they're using there, but they're not making tortillas, you know, because when we think about corn, you'd think mostly about tortillas. I think when you're in North America, especially, you know, it's because of Mexico influence and all of that. But over there, we don't eat tortillas at all, but we use corn a lot. You use it just to eat like corn on the cob or something. But indigenous people in Amazonia, corn, for them, corn is really important to make a fermented juice. They make this drink that becomes an alcoholic drink, of course, after you let it ferment for a couple of days or more. But it's such an important crop, you know, it's a very, very important thing for them that, again, represents in a way who they are, you know, because in every meeting, every celebration that they have, they will always gather around a bowl of chicha, which is made mainly out of corn. But then you go to places like Mexico and Guatemala, and again, corn, you know, it's such an important thing, corn and beans, of course, but in a very different way. They don't drink it the way they do it in Amazonia. They do make other drinks. They make atole, they make some other things like that, but are like more non-alcoholic, and they just refreshments or something. But of course, they make it as tortillas, you know, and the tortilla is something so incredibly important for those cultures, for many cultures, not just one. You know, there's like hundreds of cultures in Mexico and Guatemala that all of them, they feel like without corn, they could not survive at all. That's why they have historical record, archaeological record and stuff, all these images about corn being part of how life started in the world. You know, it's such an important thing that they have these gods and goddesses that are represented by the image of using corn and stuff like that. So it's not just food, you know, it's way more than that. It's something that is representing, is describing in a way a culture, describing certain practices, certain traditions and stuff like that. But then you move farther north, come to the US, and you start finding the same kind of thing. You know, the use of corn is really important. Harmony corn, it's so important to use it to make different types of dishes and stuff. And their agricultural, one of the most famous agricultural systems from Native Americans is the Three Sister Mound system that obviously will include corn. You know, that just that shows how important it is, because they want to have their corn, their beans, and their squashes. Without that, there's nobody, basically. You know, they cannot sustain themselves, but at the same time, they start changing who they are if you're not eating the same kind of things, you know. And it's kind of the same with us, you know, if in the Western world or whatever, if we change our diet completely, we don't feel the same, you know. We, depending what it is, depending if it's a good, a positive diet for you, you start saying like, I feel better, I feel different, you know. And we relate to that idea of like, I feel different because I'm eating something. Or I have a lot of friends from the US that travel with me to Mexico or Bolivia. And one of the first things that happen is that they get sick when they eat over there, you know. So they eat and they're like, yeah, it's so different, you know. So we understand how important food is for all of us and how we relate to it in many different ways. And always grains are a big part of it, you know, even if it's just as a drink, or even if it's made into medicine, or just because of the cultural value that you add to that particular ingredient, you know, and it's something so important. And that's why it's that a problematic relationship a little bit with wheat, for instance, you know, because it's a wonderful grain, it's an amazing grain, it's really good and all of that. But one of the problems with it is that it's been imposed to all these areas in the Americas, for instance, without really considering the cultural value or the cultural harm that you're causing by imposing something that it's not culturally relevant. It doesn't have that importance for the culture. It might have really good nutritional values and all of that. That's great. But the cultural side is something really important because it defines people, it defines who they are and all of that. And of course, we have to be careful with that as well. Here in the US, in Minneapolis, where I am, I'm talking to some of our staff, the staff in the kitchen that are Native Americans, and asking them a little bit. And one of the first things they told me about their foods and stuff, it was the importance of wild rice for some of them, like the connection they have, the importance of not only eating, but like the whole almost ritualistic component of the harvest process, like, and we are developing a small booklet for education purposes right now that talks about this, like to highlight a little bit the importance of the correct way of harvesting, the traditional way of harvesting rice, and who should be doing that and all of that, and how are they doing it, and how much value that adds to the actual food, because the rice, to eat it, it's one thing, but like where it comes from and how it's been acquired, it's something so important. It's once you read or study a little bit how that whole process is, you realize how these cultures have so much wisdom. They have such vast knowledge, but about their environment and everything, that the way they're harvesting traditionally for many, many years, they've been doing it in a way that it's very sustainable, that it's very in tune with their environment, in tune with all the other elements that are surrounding the wild rice. That grows in these lakes and stuff. So they're like making sure that they drop some of the wild rice in the water on purpose, because they know that animals that live there, they're going to eat it. But at the same time, the ones are not going to be eaten, they're going to regrow again for next year. So little things like that you see that how important is that connection, that knowledge with your environment, to understand that Mother Earth is offering you something beautiful and wonderful, and you should acknowledge it and be very respectful of it. Instead of just taking it, make sure to take what you need, but leave some behind. So you can continue the cycle in a sustainable way. The whole interaction, if you want, with wheat, historically, it's been very complicated, fascinating at the same time, in both like very positive and maybe not as positive ways, especially for different groups of people as well. I feel like like I was saying, for me, for instance, personally, it is an interesting thing, because I see in a way the slightly negative side of it, how much has been imposed and all of that. But at the same time, when I was born, my family was already embraced wheat and eating all this bread and everything. And now especially this particular type of bread that we make in La Paz, it's something that I feel like it's part of who I am. It's so important to me. We have this type of empanadas that we make, and recently learned how to make them because I miss them so much, so I had to make them. But they're with wheat flour. And that's something so important for me, because it's part of who I am. It's part of my family and my connection with my family, my country, and all of that, But I'm well aware that wheat is not local. Wheat comes from European side, and it was pushed through the colonial times and all of that, So it is this interesting way of seeing it, because there are some positive side of things. It's okay to embrace it. It's okay to understand that it's part of who you are, and it's part of your diet. It's beneficial. But incorporating new things to your food ways doesn't mean that you're necessarily rejecting everything else that you had traditionally, originally. That's an important part of what indigenous food ways, and talking about indigenous food sovereignty in general, it's understanding the concept of culture, understanding the concept of food ways. So understanding that those concepts are dynamic, they're not static, it's something that it adapts through time, it changes, it borrows things from other cultures and make them your own, but in a respectful way, in a ethical way, and all of that, that makes sense to the environment, that makes sense to your culture and all of that. So understanding that that the whole process is dynamic, it's something important. The most problematic thing about wheat, and historically it's been just like thrown there. It's like, you must eat this because we're not going to allow you to grow anything else, you know. And that is a problematic thing. But if you offer it in a way that it's, hey, this is an addition, you should try it, and if you like it, use it. If you don't reject it, it's okay as well, you know. And that is kind of the type of discussion, in a very simplistic way, obviously, but that's kind of the discussion that is bringing us to these issues of food sovereignty around the world, to discuss, like, we want to decide what do we want to eat. And then we might decide that we want to eat this wheat, we want to eat maybe transgenic corn or whatever, but let us decide instead of just like pushing, you know. And that's why also there is a difficult to find a balance, because it becomes a play of power in a way. You know, the most powerful ones, the ones that are growing most of the wheat and stuff, they're saying like, hey, here, eat it and shut up, basically, you know. And that is a little bit problematic. We're not giving the power to the local people, local communities, to say like, hey, let us try, let us see, let us decide, you know. And that is part of what we're trying to do through our work as well, you know, working with communities, reinforcing the idea of eating your local foods, your traditional ways of cooking and all of that, using your local ingredients, using your indigenous ingredients in a way to serve, well, the whole idea is to almost empower people with their own knowledge, with their own traditions, with their own foods. And with that, when they feel more empowered, everybody, all of us feel more empowered, maybe we'll feel more open to say like, wait a minute, let's talk about this, but at the same level. And we're not there yet, because we're not talking at the same level at all. You know, there's still like these hierarchies that are drawn by many different ways. I think a lot of people here in the US don't realize the level of influence that the US has over most of the world, especially the developing world, you know, like the influence of the US in Latin America, for instance, it's incredible. That's why whenever like there are big things going on in the US, it's always in the main headlines in all the newspapers in Latin America, because it's going to affect us, all of us, you know, in many ways, even if it's something that here nobody's really thinking that how much that is affecting the rest of the world. And that's one of the things, like the thing with wheat, for instance, we have in Bolivia and in the whole South America, we have a lot of wheat because it was sent from the US, you know. So the US was having this process going through here in their own country, but at the same time, they have extra that they were pushing to these developing countries with many different ideas, you know, with ideas of development or support, whatever they were, but it was just having an effect elsewhere as well. So it's not just here, you know. What happens here has a very strong effect everywhere. I think one of the important things to think is that everybody has a lot of knowledge that can share with everybody else. You know, doesn't matter where you come from, doesn't matter who you are, you have a lot of knowledge with you that might come through your grandparents or your brothers, sisters, whatever, or your neighborhood, but you have information, you have knowledge that you can share. And that is something really important to remember, you know, because sometimes we don't think much about that. So we all have something to offer. And that's an important thing, because most of the, especially from my experience, all indigenous cultures that I work with, they're, if you approach them in a respectful way, in a proper way, ethical way, putting everybody at the same level as well, they're always open to conversation. They're open to discussion. They're open to sharing, because it's such an important part of their culture. Even for us, it's such an important thing. Sharing, it's a big part of who we are. We love to share. We are engaging always in sharing and reciprocity and all of that. And historically, humans, we've been doing that. So that's an important thing to remember. You know, we have to think, and it might sound very basic and silly, but that's important, because if you remember that you also have some things to share, well, you can start communicating or interacting with Native Americans, indigenous communities, or whoever you want, and start understanding that culture, learning a little bit, by letting them share some of their knowledge with you, but at the same time, you sharing some of the knowledge with them, but in a respectful way. Again, not trying to impose ideas, not trying to any of that, try to avoid ethnocentrism as much as possible, So you want to use the concept of cultural relativism as much as possible instead of ethnocentrism, So and then just engage, then just learn about your land, learn where do you live, learn about the cultures that live around you, and then interact with them. Don't be afraid of it. There's nothing to, nobody's going to say anything to you if you approach it in a respectful way. If you are curious enough and you're respectful enough, nobody's going to kick you out or anything, and you're not trying to go and become a Native American person, but you're just trying to learn from them a little bit and share what you have to share with them as well, and then create a better community.